The year was 1170, and the Welsh borderlands were a realm where Norman conquest and Celtic resistance clashed like steel against stone, where the fate of a baron's daughter could be decided by men with gold and grudges. As Lady Gwyneth stood, trembling upon the wooden platform in her father's castle courtyard, the weight of unpaid war debts pressed heavier than the iron shackles that might soon bind her to a life of servitude. No one expected the silent figure watching from the shadows beyond the castle walls. No one anticipated how the arrival of a Celtic warrior named Cian would forever alter the course of their lives. The autumn wind swept across the courtyard stones, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and the bitter taste of defeat. Gwyneth's hands, bound with silk cord more for ceremony than restraint, trembled not from cold, but from the humiliation of standing before a crowd of leering Norman lords like a prize mare at market. Her father, Baron Aldrich, stood to one side of the platform, his once proud shoulders bowed beneath the weight of circumstances that had reduced his noble daughter to chattel. "Gentlemen," called Lord Reginald de Montfort, his voice cutting through the murmur of assembled buyers with the authority of a man accustomed to having his words obeyed. The Norman lord's narrow face, framed by meticulously trimmed dark hair, bore the cold calculation of a predator circling wounded prey. "We gather today to resolve the matter of Baron Aldrich's considerable debts to the crown, debts incurred during his misguided support of Welsh rebels." Gwyneth lifted her chin, meeting de Montfort's calculating gaze with defiance that burned despite her helpless position. At 19, she had grown into a woman of uncommon beauty, with hair the colour of autumn wheat and eyes that held the fierce green of Celtic forests. She had managed her father's household since her mother's death 3 years prior, holding together what remained of their family with steady hands and unwavering loyalty. "The terms are simple," de Montfort continued, his thin lips curving into what might charitably be called a smile. "Lady Gwyneth's hand in marriage, along with her dowry rights to the baron's remaining lands, will settle the debt of 2,000 marks. The bidding begins at 500 marks. A ripple of interest passed through the gathered nobles, their eyes appraising Gwyneth with the same attention they might give to horseflesh or fertile farmland. She felt bile rise in her throat as hands gestured and voices murmured, reducing her worth to mere silver. Beyond the castle walls, where ancient oaks cast long shadows across the borderland hills, a figure moved with the fluid silence of a hunting wolf. The Celtic warrior had been watching since dawn, his dark eyes taking in every detail of the Norman proceedings with the patience of a man who understood that timing meant the difference between victory and death. Earlier that morning, before the castle courtyard had filled with Norman lords and their calculating gazes, Baron Aldrich sat hunched over the oak table in his private chambers, staring at parchments that spelled out his family's ruin. The pre-dawn light filtering through the narrow window cast long shadows across documents bearing the royal seal, each one a reminder of debts that had grown like poison ivy, choking the life from his once prosperous holdings. Gwyneth entered, without ceremony, carrying a tray of bread and ale that neither of them would touch. She had learned to read her father's moods in the set of his shoulders, and this morning they spoke of defeat more eloquently than any words could manage. "How much do we owe?" she asked quietly, setting the tray aside and moving to stand behind his chair. There was no point in pretending ignorance. She had seen the royal messengers arriving with increasing frequency over the past months. Aldrich's weathered hands trembled slightly as he gestured to the documents. 2,000 marks to the crown, another 500 to de Montfort, personally, for damages incurred during the Welsh uprising. The numbers struck Gwyneth like physical blows. She had known their situation was dire since her father had chosen to support Prince Rhys's rebellion against Norman rule 2 years past, but the true scope of their predicament had been hidden from her until now. The castle, the lands. she whispered. "Forfeit if the debt isn't settled by sunset today." Aldrich's voice cracked like autumn leaves. "I gambled everything on Welsh independence, daughter. I believed we could throw off the Norman yoke, return to the old ways. Instead, I've doomed us both." Steward Marcus, who had served the family since before Gwyneth's birth, cleared his throat from the doorway. His lined face reflected years of watching proud Welsh lords brought low by Norman politics. "My lord, there is one option remaining. Lord de Montfort has made an offer." Gwyneth felt ice form in her veins as understanding dawned. "He wants me." "A marriage arrangement," Marcus said carefully. "Your hand would settle all debts and allow you to retain a portion of your inheritance." "As his property," Gwyneth said bitterly. Aldrich finally looked up at his daughter, his eyes red-rimmed with shame and sleepless nights. "I would rather see us both begging in the streets than sell you to that Norman viper, but Marcus says there are precedents, other impoverished lords who have used such arrangements." "An auction," Marcus admitted reluctantly, "to ensure the best possible match and maximize the settlement value." The silence that followed seemed to stretch into eternity. Gwyneth placed her hands on her father's shoulders, feeling how thin he had become beneath his woolen tunic. "If this is our only path, then we take it with what dignity remains." The bidding commenced with the methodical precision of men accustomed to acquiring property, whether it be land, livestock, or in this case, a baron's daughter. Lord Geoffrey de Clare raised his hand first, his pudgy fingers glinting with rings as he called out, 600 marks. His eyes lingered on Gwyneth with the same appreciation he might show for a particularly fine hunting hound. 700, countered Sir William of Pembroke, a lean man whose reputation for cruelty toward Welsh tenants was well known throughout the borderlands. His bid carried an undertone of malice that made Gwyneth's skin crawl. Beyond the castle walls, concealed among the ancient stones of a crumbling watchtower, Cian observed the proceedings with the controlled fury of a wolf watching hunters circle his pack. He had arrived before dawn, following rumors that had traveled the hidden paths between Celtic settlements like wildfire. The daughter of Baron Aldrich, one of the few Norman lords who had shown respect for Welsh customs and rights, was being sold like cattle to settle war debts. His dark eyes, the colour of storm clouds over the Irish Sea, tracked each bidder with the predatory focus of a warrior who had learned to read men's souls in their faces. De Montfort's orchestration of this spectacle spoke of calculated humiliation designed to break more than just Aldrich's financial power. It was meant to demonstrate Norman dominance over any who dared support Welsh independence. 800 marks, called another voice, and Cian's jaw tightened as he recognized Lord Reginald's younger brother, Edmund, whose appetites ran toward breaking spirited women to his will. Gwyneth stood straighter with each successive bid, her chin raised in defiance that reminded Cian of the Celtic princesses in the old stories his grandmother had told. She would not go meekly to whatever fate these Norman vultures planned for her. The fire in her green eyes spoke of bloodlines that reached back to the ancient kings of Wales, blood that refused to bow despite circumstances. 900, de Montfort himself interjected smoothly, his tone suggesting this was merely the opening move in a longer game. Though I confess, gentlemen, I find myself reluctant to part with such a prize to any but the most appreciative bidder. The implied threat in his words was clear enough. Whoever won this auction would do so only with de Montfort's sufferance, making them complicit in his larger schemes for consolidating power in the Welsh borderlands. Cian's hand moved instinctively to the hilt of his sword, though he remained motionless in the shadows. His people's ancient laws spoke clearly about the rights of women to choose their own paths, laws that had been forgotten as Norman customs spread like plague across the land. The warrior's weathered face hardened into resolve as he watched the bidding climb toward 1,000 marks. The time for action was drawing near. The bidding had reached 1,000 marks when the heavy oak gates of the castle courtyard burst, open with a sound like thunder. Every head turned as a lone figure strode purposefully across the cobblestones, his presence commanding immediate attention despite, or perhaps because of, his foreign appearance. Cian moved with the fluid grace of a born warrior, his long dark hair braided with silver rings that caught the autumn sunlight. He wore the traditional garb of a Celtic chieftain, a woolen cloak dyed deep blue and fastened with an ornate bronze brooch, leather breeches, and a shirt of fine linen. At his side hung a sword whose ancient hilt spoke of bloodlines reaching back to the mists of legend. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" de Montfort demanded, his hand moving instinctively toward his own weapon as murmurs of alarm rippled through the assembled nobles. Cian ignored him completely, his storm-dark eyes fixed on Gwyneth. When he spoke, his voice carried the natural authority of a man accustomed to being heard, though his accent marked him clearly as one of the unconquered Welsh. 1,500 marks, he announced, his words cutting through the courtyard's tension like a blade through silk. A shocked silence fell over the gathering. Several Norman lords reached for weapons, while others stepped back instinctively from this Celtic warrior who dared interrupt their proceedings. "This is preposterous," sputtered Sir William, his face flushing red. "No savage has the right to participate in civilized proceedings." Cian's expression remained impassive as he reached into a leather pouch at his waist, withdrawing a collection of gold coins and silver arm rings that glinted in the afternoon light. The treasure spilled across the wooden platform with a sound that commanded immediate attention. 1,500 marks in gold and silver, he repeated calmly. "More than enough to settle Baron Aldrich's debts by the terms you've established." De Montfort's face darkened with fury. "You dare mock Norman law, Celtic dog. This gathering is for civilized men, not barbarian raiders." "I mock nothing," Cian replied, his tone remaining level despite the insult. "I offer fair payment for what you have wrongfully put to auction. Among my people, a woman's worth cannot be measured in coin, but if Norman custom demands it, I meet your price." Gwyneth stared at this unexpected savior, her heart hammering against her ribs. Everything about him spoke of barely contained power, from the scars that marked his sword arm to the way he held himself ready for violence, despite his outwardly peaceful demeanor. "Remove this barbarian immediately," de Montfort ordered his guards, but they hesitated, unwilling to be the first to draw steel against a man whose reputation as a warrior was evidently well known even among Normans. The courtyard balanced on a knife's edge, teetering between negotiation and bloodshed. The tension in the courtyard finally broke when Baron Aldrich stepped forward, his weathered face grave with the weight of impossible choices. "Gentlemen, we shall settle this matter properly, according to law and custom. If this Celtic lord wishes to make formal claim, then let him present his case in the great hall where such matters are properly adjudicated." Within the hour, the castle's great hall had been transformed into an impromptu court of law. Tapestries bearing the arms of Norman houses lined the stone walls, while rushes scattered across the floor muffled the footsteps of those gathering to witness this unprecedented confrontation between two legal traditions that had rarely intersected so directly. De Montfort positioned himself at the high table like a magistrate, though his authority to preside over such proceedings was questionable at best. The assembled Norman lords arranged themselves according to rank, their faces reflecting varying degrees of outrage and curiosity at the Celtic warrior's audacious challenge to their established order. Cian stood before them with unwavering composure, no longer alone. Beside him stood an elderly man whose white beard and elaborately carved staff marked him as a brehon, one of the ancient Celtic judges whose knowledge of traditional law stretched back generations before Norman boots had ever touched Welsh soil. I am Myrdin ap Gruffydd, the old judge announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had settled disputes when many present were still children. I speak for ancient laws that governed these lands before your conquest, laws that recognize rights your Norman customs do not acknowledge. This is absurd, de Montfort declared, his patience clearly wearing thin. Celtic barbarism has no standing in civilized proceedings. The woman is chattel, her value determined by her father's debts. Under Hywald's laws, Myrdin countered calmly, a woman possesses the right to refuse marriage, regardless of family obligations. Moreover, debts incurred through warfare cannot be settled through forced matrimony when alternative payment is offered. Cian stepped forward, his dark eyes meeting Gwyneth's across the hall. I invoke the right of Athrodal, he said, using the ancient Welsh term that sent murmurs rippling through the assembled Celts, who understood its significance. The right to offer protection to one wrongfully imperiled. Baron Aldrich's expression shifted from confusion to recognition. Despite his Norman allegiances, he had been raised on these borderlands where old customs died hard. You claim ancient sanctuary rights? I do, Cian replied firmly. Under laws that predate Norman occupation, I offer my protection and my gold to prevent an injustice that violates the customs of this land's true people. The hall erupted in angry voices as Norman lords protested this appeal to superseded legal traditions, while the few Welsh witnesses present nodded approval. As the formal proceedings adjourned into heated private discussions among the Norman lords, Gwyneth found herself walking the castle's herb garden in the fading afternoon light. The autumn air carried the scent of dying rosemary and sage, familiar comforts in a day that had turned her world upside down. She had requested time to consider the impossible choice laid before her, though in truth she needed escape from the suffocating weight of so many male voices determining her fate, my lady. The voice behind her was quiet, respectful, carrying that distinctive Welsh accent that had commanded such attention in the great hall. She turned to find Cian standing near the garden's stone archway, his imposing presence somehow gentled by the late sunlight filtering through the apple trees. Up close, she could see the silver threading through his dark hair, the lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent scanning distant horizons for threats to his people. You should not be here, she said, though her tone carried no real reproof. The Norman lords would consider this improper. I care little for Norman propriety, he replied, moving closer but maintaining respectful distance. I care about understanding what my intervention has thrust upon you. Gwyneth studied his face, searching for signs of the calculating ambition she had seen in every Norman suitor. Instead, she found something that unsettled her more, genuine concern. Why? She asked simply. Why would a Celtic warrior risk his life for a Norman lord's daughter? Cian was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting to the mountains visible beyond the castle walls. My grandmother told stories of the old alliances, when Welsh and Norman worked together against common enemies, before conquest poisoned everything with suspicion and hatred. He looked back at her. Perhaps because I believe some things are worth preserving, regardless of bloodlines. And if I choose your protection over de Montfort's, what then? I know nothing of your people's ways, your customs. You would learn if you wished. His voice carried no demands, only possibility. Among my people, marriage is partnership, not ownership. A woman keeps her own name, her own voice in tribal councils. Brother Francis, the castle's elderly chaplain, appeared at the garden's edge, his kind face troubled. My lady, your father requests your presence. The lords have reached an impasse. As they walked back toward the castle, Gwyneth felt the weight of decision pressing against her chest like armor too heavy to bear. Behind them, Cian followed at proper distance, yet she found herself acutely aware of his presence, a reminder that impossible choices sometimes offered unexpected paths forward. The future remained unwritten, balanced between two worlds that seemed destined never to understand each other. 20 miles from Aldrich's castle, hidden in a valley where ancient oaks stood sentinel over Celtic fires that had burned for generations, Cian knelt before the war council of his people. The journey through moonlit hills had taken him most of the night, but time was a luxury they could not afford. By dawn, de Montfort would expect an answer, and that answer would need the backing of more than one warrior's courage. Chieftain Brennan, whose grey beard bore the braids of 40 years' leadership, studied Cian with eyes that had witnessed the slow erosion of Welsh independence. Around the central fire sat the elected representatives of 5 allied clans, men and women whose faces reflected the weight of decisions that could mean life or death for their people. "You ask much, young wolf," Brennan said finally, using the war name Cian had earned in battles against Norman expansion. "To challenge de Montfort's authority openly risks bringing royal attention to our valley." "The royal attention will come regardless," replied Morfydd, the silver-haired woman who spoke for the coastal clans. De Montfort's appetite for Welsh lands grows with each passing season. Today, he takes one baron's daughter through false law. Tomorrow, he claims our hunting grounds by the same methods. Cian leaned forward, firelight dancing across his weathered features. Baron Aldrich was one of the few Norman lords who honoured the old treaties, who allowed our people passage through his lands when the king's roads were closed to us. If we abandon him now, we lose the last ally we have among the conquerors. "And if we support him?" asked Rodri, the youngest member of the council, whose scars from recent skirmishes still showed pink against his pale skin. "De Montfort commands 200 knights. We have perhaps 50 warriors between all our settlements." "Numbers matter less than legitimacy," interjected Myrddin, the elderly Brehon who had accompanied Cian from the castle. "The girl has been offered protection under ancient law. To honour that claim, we need not face Norman steel in open battle. We need only ensure the legal challenge reaches ears that still remember justice." Brennan's expression grew thoughtful as he gazed into the flames. "The Archbishop of St. David's still holds to the old agreements between our peoples. If we could present this case to ecclesiastical court, church law supersedes Norman civil authority in matters of marriage and sanctuary," Morfydd agreed, her tone carrying new hope. "And church law recognizes Celtic legal traditions dating back to St. Patrick himself." The council's mood shifted perceptibly as strategy replaced resignation. Cian felt the familiar stirring of his people's greatest strength, their ability to find paths through seemingly impossible obstacles. "Then we ride at first light," Brennan declared. "Not to war, but to remind the world that Welsh law has not died." Dawn had barely broken over the castle walls when the sound of armed riders shattered the morning quiet. Gwyneth woke to shouting in the courtyard below, her heart racing as she recognized the harsh voices of men who cared nothing for honor or law. Through her chamber window, she could see at least a dozen mounted figures, in mail and leather, their faces bearing the hard lines of professional soldiers rather than noble knights. Lord de Montfort sat his destrier in the centre of the courtyard, his thin face twisted with the cold fury of a man whose authority had been publicly challenged. Behind him, the mercenaries he had hired from the Welsh borderlands waited with the patient menace of wolves preparing to feed. "Baron Aldrich," de Montfort called, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp morning air. "I come to collect what is rightfully mine. The Celtic savage's gold means nothing. No court in Christendom would honour the claims of barbarian law over Norman justice." Gwyneth dressed hastily, her hands trembling as she fastened her kirtle. Through the thin castle walls she could hear her father's voice, strained but defiant. "The matter awaits proper adjudication, de Montfort. You have no right to take my daughter by force." "Rights?" De Montfort's laughter held no humour. "I have the right of might, old man. Your debts are owed to me personally, and I choose to collect them now." The sound of steel being drawn sent ice through Gwyneth's veins. She grabbed her cloak and rushed from her chamber, taking the narrow servant's stair that would bring her to the great hall without passing through the courtyard. Her father needed to know that de Montfort had brought hired killers, not lawful knights bound by codes of chivalry. In the great hall, she found Baron Aldrich facing the impossible choice between resistance that would mean death for his household, the guards and submission that would doom his daughter. His weathered hands shook as he gripped his sword, knowing full well that his handful of aging retainers could not stand against seasoned mercenaries. "Father," Gwyneth whispered, appearing at his side, "there must be another way." "Surrender the girl now," de Montfort's voice echoed from the courtyard, "and I might allow you to keep your life along with your shame. Resist, and I'll burn this castle with you inside it." Through the hall's windows, Gwyneth could see the mercenaries, spreading out to surround the building, their movements methodical and professional. These were not men who would be swayed by appeals to honor or mercy. They served gold, not God. "The Celtic warrior spoke of sanctuary," she said desperately. "Perhaps Cian is miles away," her father replied grimly. "Whatever help he promised will not arrive in time." The sound of splintering wood announced that de Montfort's patience had ended. The sanctuary bells of Lanfy's Abbey had rung through the night, calling all to witness an unprecedented gathering in the monastery's ancient chapter house. 3 days had passed since Cian's timely arrival. With his warband had driven de Montfort's mercenaries from Baron Aldrich's gates, but victory in battle had only postponed the deeper conflict that threatened to engulf the borderlands in blood. Abbot William, whose grey robes marked him as a Benedictine, but whose Welsh accent revealed deeper loyalties, presided over the most unusual assembly in the monastery's 400-year history. At the massive oak table that had once hosted kings sat representatives of two worlds that had rarely found common ground. Norman lords bound by feudal law and Celtic chieftains governed by traditions older than Rome. Gwyneth sat beside her father, acutely aware of Cian's presence across the table. The Celtic warrior had cleaned the battle grime from his armor, but his hand never strayed far from his sword hilt. The past days had forged between them an understanding deeper than words. She had seen him fight to protect her freedom, and he had witnessed her courage in standing against forces that would reduce her to property. "The Church recognizes ancient sanctuary rights," Abbot William began, his voice carrying the authority of one who had mediated border disputes for decades. "But sanctuary cannot be permanent. We must find resolution that honors both Norman law and Celtic tradition." Sir Edmund de Clare, who had ridden from Pembroke to represent Norman interests, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "The King's law is clear regarding debts and obligations. We cannot simply ignore established precedent because Celtic barbarians object. Nor can we ignore laws that govern these lands before Norman boots touched Welsh soil," countered Murden, the elderly Breon, whose presence lent legitimacy to the Celtic position. Gwyneth found her voice, speaking into the tense silence. "What if we created something new, a legal framework that acknowledges both traditions?" All eyes turned to her, some skeptical, others curious. She continued, her confidence growing. "A binding contract under church law, witnessed by both Norman and Celtic authorities, one that settles my father's debts while recognizing my right to choose my own path." Cian leaned forward, understanding immediately. "A marriage alliance, but one governed by Celtic consent laws rather than Norman property rights. Preposterous," Sir Edmund sputtered. "Marriage contracts are matters of family honor and financial obligation, not individual whim." "Not under Church doctrine, Abbot William observed thoughtfully. Canon law requires consent from both parties, regardless of secular customs. For the first time since the crisis began, Gwyneth dared to hope that impossible choices might yield to innovative solutions. The great hall of Rhuddlan Castle had been transformed into a court of final judgment, its stone walls echoing with the weight of precedent about to be shattered or forged anew. King Henry's representative, Lord Chief Justice Ranulph de Glanville, presided from the high seat, his weathered face reflecting the gravity of adjudicating a case that could reshape the legal relationship between Norman and Celtic peoples throughout the Welsh borderlands. Gwyneth stood as the central witness, her testimony having laid the foundation for an unprecedented legal argument. The ancient Celtic laws of consent, she had declared before the assembled court, predated Norman conquest and deserved recognition under the Church's doctrine of natural law. Her clear voice had carried across the hall, reaching Norman lords, who had never before heard a woman speak with such authority in legal proceedings. "The Celtic custom claims legitimacy," Lord Justice Ranulph announced, his words measured and deliberate. Yet Lord de Montfort contests this through his champion's right of trial by combat, asserting that might determines right in matters of conquest. Sir Gareth the Black, de Montfort's chosen champion, stood in full mail beside the marked circle that would serve as the field of honour. His reputation as a killer was well known throughout the borderlands. 7 men had died beneath his sword in previous trials, their causes buried with their blood. Cian stepped forward, accepting the challenge that would determine not just Gwyneth's fate, but the validity of Celtic legal traditions in Norman-dominated courts. He wore no mail, only the leather and wool of his people, carrying the ancient sword that had belonged to his grandfather's line. "Know this," he called to the assembled witnesses, his voice carrying the authority of ancient chieftains. "I fight not for personal glory, but for the right of all Celtic peoples to be heard in the courts of this land." The circle was blessed by both Norman priests and Celtic druids in an accommodation that would have been unthinkable months earlier. As the two warriors faced each other, weapons drawn, Gwyneth felt her heart hammering against her ribs. Everything they had built, the alliance at the monastery, the legal arguments, the hope for a different future, balanced on the edge of Cian's blade. Sir Gareth attacked with practiced brutality, his heavy sword seeking to end the contest quickly, through overwhelming force. But Cian moved with the fluid grace of a man who had learned to fight in the hills and forests of Wales, where speed and cunning mattered more than strength. The clash of steel rang through the hall as two worlds collided in mortal combat. 6 months after Cian's blade had found its mark in Sir Gareth's throat, ending both the trial by combat and de Montfort's legal challenge, the borderlands had witnessed the birth of something unprecedented. Where Baron Aldrich's old castle had once stood as a Norman stronghold, a new settlement now sprawled across the valley floor, part Celtic roundhouse village, part Norman manor, wholly unlike anything that had existed before. Gwyneth stood beside the mill wheel that Celtic engineers had designed but Norman craftsmen had built, watching the mixed community that had grown around their radical experiment in cooperation. Children with Celtic names played alongside those bearing Norman ones, their laughter carrying no awareness of the ancient hatreds their parents were slowly learning to set aside. "The king's tax collectors arrived this morning," Cian reported, approaching from the settlement's heart, where he had been mediating a dispute between a Welsh herder and a Norman grain merchant. Despite the legal victory that had established their rights, practical challenges arose daily as two peoples attempted to forge a single community. "What do they make of our arrangement?" Gwyneth asked, noting the wariness in her husband's dark eyes. The wedding ceremony, 6 months past, had blended traditions from both cultures, vows spoken in Latin and Welsh, witnessed by Norman nobles and Celtic chieftains alike. "Confusion, mostly," Cian replied with a slight smile. "They cannot determine whether to treat us as a Norman manor or a Celtic clan settlement. Our tax obligations remain unclear. From the fields beyond the mill, voices rose in heated discussion. Gwyneth recognized the tones of another cultural collision, Norman expectations of rigid seasonal labor conflicting with Celtic traditions of communal work-sharing. Such conflicts arose weekly, each requiring patient negotiation and creative compromise. Thomas de Clare withdrew his family yesterday, she said quietly, the third Norman household to leave this month. Cian nodded grimly, and Rhodri's cousin questions why we accommodate Norman customs at all. Building bridges requires sacrifices from both sides, and not all are willing to pay that price. Despite the challenges, Gwyneth felt a deep satisfaction watching their impossible dream take tangible form. The legal framework hammered out at Llanfaes Abbey had proven workable, if complex. Celtic consent laws operated alongside Norman inheritance customs, while church oversight provided neutral arbitration when conflicts arose. Brother Francis brings word from other settlements, Cian continued. 3 more communities have requested copies of our charter. The idea spreads, however, slowly. As evening approached and cookfires began dotting the settlement, Gwyneth reflected on how far they had travelled from that terrible morning on the auction block. The path ahead remained uncertain, marked by resistance from those who preferred the simplicity of ancient hatreds, but each day of successful coexistence proved that different worlds could indeed find common ground. The harvest festival of 1171 brought delegations from across the Welsh borderlands to witness what many had deemed impossible, a thriving community where Norman and Celtic traditions had not merely coexisted, but had woven together into something entirely new. The settlement that had grown from desperate necessity now stood as proof that different worlds could indeed merge without one consuming the other. Gwyneth stood beside the great oak, where the festival fires burned, watching her husband address the assembled crowd in the mixture of Latin, Welsh and Norman French that had become the settlement's common tongue. 1 year of marriage had deepened their partnership beyond the political alliance that had first brought them together. They had learned to navigate not only their cultural differences, but the daily challenges of governing a community that had no precedent in law or custom. Representatives from the Archbishop of Canterbury's court, Cian murmured as he rejoined her, nodding toward a group of finely dressed clerics examining the settlement's charter with obvious interest. They've come to study our legal framework for potential adoption in other border regions. The validation felt surreal to Gwyneth, who still sometimes woke expecting to find herself back on that auction block where her nightmare had begun. Instead, she had found herself at the center of something that chroniclers were already calling the Llanfaes experiment, a new model for relations between conquered and conqueror. Around them, the festival continued with traditions that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. Celtic harpers played alongside Norman troubadours, while children born in the settlement's first year were blessed by both druids and priests in ceremonies that honored multiple spiritual paths. The King's Justiciar has requested a formal report, Gwyneth informed her husband, producing a scroll bearing royal seals. Henry himself may visit come spring to observe our innovative approach to territorial governance. Cian's weathered face broke into the rare, full smile that still made her heart quicken. From auction block to royal attention, quite a journey for a baron's daughter. For a Celtic warrior as well, she replied, taking his scarred hand in hers. As twilight settled over the valley, Gwyneth reflected on how completely their lives had transformed. The personal crisis that had once threatened to destroy her future had instead become the catalyst for changes neither could have imagined. Their settlement housed nearly 300 souls now, with requests arriving weekly from other communities seeking guidance in bridging their own cultural divides. The future stretched before them, no longer constrained by the limitations that had once seemed absolute, but open to possibilities as yet unimagined.